This book follows I always forget the names of the people in books. I am so good at this. Hello everybody, my name is Kelsey and we're about to get very, very nerdy with my favorite books from this year. Happy end of the year. So the very last video that I always do is my favorites from the year, and it just so happens that one of my video days is the very last day of the year, which is just kind of cool. So today we are going to go through my top 10 books that are my favorite from this year. And it was kind of interesting putting this list together because I usually have some issues when I do my top 10 list because I always want to have like honorable mentions, and I always just want to have so many. I can't tell you how many times I've almost done a top 15 instead of a top 10 just because there's a few that I really love and want to talk about. And this year was different. This year, like, I went through my reading and I read a lot of really exciting things that I very much enjoyed reading, and looking back on, I'm like, oh, that was a good book. But narrowing it down to like 10 books was really easy. So I either had some really good books or like my standout books of all time for this year. It's just like held the test of time. So I'm excited to dive in and let's get started. Coming in at number 10 is Half a Soul, and this is by Olivia Atwater. This is actually a viewer recommended book. So one of you lovely individuals out there told me I should pick this one up because it's kind of like a Regency England book, but it's got magic in it. So like if you like Jane Austen, this is perfect because it's Jane Austen with fairies. And if you weren't the most accurate thing I've ever heard, I loved this book, clearly. This takes place in, like I mentioned, Regency England time period. So you do have all of the like societal norms and things that you would expect from that time period, except for magic is a thing. So we follow our main character, Theodora, and when she was really young, she ended up kind of making a deal with a fae somehow and ended up giving him half of her soul. So she has half of her soul left in her body, and it's only the boring parts of her. So she can't really express any emotions. If things that she says upsets people, she can't understand why. She just doesn't really emote very much. And so because of that, she's looked down upon by her family. She lives with her cousin and her aunt. And they go to London because her cousin is at that right age where she needs to get married, and they're convinced that like Theodora is just, no one's going to snag her attention. But she ends up getting the attention of the Lord Sorcerer of England, and that's like the guy that's hired by the king to be the sorcerer for the entire country. He's very much like a stick in the mud kind of person. He doesn't really do societal norms very well. He doesn't really understand them, and so Theodora is just fascinating to him, and so they end up connecting, and he ends up agreeing to kind of help her figure out maybe she can get her soul back. Like, how does she go back to being kind of normal? And it's their story, and I just loved it. I really enjoyed the writing of it. It was definitely more contemporary in the sense of like you could understand what was going on, but it did have this air of Regency to it, so it did kind of feel like a Jane Austen book, but different. And I loved how the characters were. I loved the story itself, the kind of meshing of magic with a time period that we know pretty well, as far as like being relatively rigid with its political and societal norms and stuff like that. And I don't know, it's just really fascinating seeing these two things mesh and seeing this time period that like is something from our own history, but mix it with magic. I don't know, it was really fascinating. So I just really loved the plot. I loved the story. I loved how it was written. It captivated me right away, and I can't wait to read more things by this author. It's definitely got the vibes of an indie story. So if you love an indie author, indie publisher, that kind of thing, this is going to definitely be your book. If you like historical fiction in any way, I think you would enjoy this. But it just took me heart and soul. I loved it. Heart and soul. I didn't mean to do that. I loved it so much. Coming in at number 9 is Being Mary Bennet, and this is by J.C. Peterson. This one was surprising because it's a YA book. I didn't really expect much going into it, especially a YA contemporary. I've noticed that contemporary books that are set in like high school time period don't really hold the same interest for me anymore, especially if it's a romance, because that's just a time period that I've been removed from for so long that I can appreciate it on the surface, but like as far as like going out of my way and wanting to read that kind of romance, I'd rather read an adult romance or something like that. So I wasn't really sure going into this one, but it was based on Jane Austen, so I thought I'd give it a try, and it ended up being amazing. This book follows Marnie Barnes, who is the middle sister in a family of 5, just like Mary Bennet, and she has always thought of herself as like a main character, and then some stuff happens at the beginning of the book that kind of readjusts her thinking a little bit, and she realizes, oh, maybe I'm not actually as upfront main characters I think I am. Maybe I am Mary Bennet. And she goes, no, we're going to change that. Mary Bennet's the forgotten sister. But there's a lot more to it. There's a conversation between her and her sisters, and just those, like, you know, conflicts that you have with your sisters and living up to pressure. And I consider her mom to be a relatively toxic mother, so you've got that pressure as well, and just kind of seeing Marnie come into her own and really just stand up for herself and do what she wants rather than what she thinks her family wants her to do. And then there's a lot more to it than that. There's definitely some romance elements going along on this, but what I loved about this is that yes, it does have that feel of having a younger main character being in high school. It is a private high school, so she is living like on campus, kind of like a college, so maybe that helps a little bit, but it is set in that like high school time period. She's worried about college, and I think just she's such a real person, and the way it was written was very much not like what I expected from a YA book. Like, there's just, I don't know how to explain it, but there's definitely a way that YA books are written for younger readers, and this didn't kind of dumb it down is not the right word, but that's the only thing I can think of right now. It's just kind of like dumb down some of the situations or steer clear of some of the harder topics, and they don't do that. They talk about everything right up front, and really just seeing Marnie stumble and mess up and figure out what she wants, and that's just very realistic for this age, which I think she's about 17, 18 if I'm correct. So I really adored this book. I loved seeing all of the little hints to Jane Austen. That was very fun for me, but really was just watching her be a mess and then figure it out was just kind of fun. I just thought it was very well done, and whether you're a Jane Austen fan or not, I think there are definitely elements in this that you will love. The next one, coming in at number 8, is Her Majesty's Royal Coven, and this is by Juno Dawson. I've definitely talked a lot about this one this month specifically, but I read this one in October and it just blew me away. It's basically a world of magic. So you have this thing called the HMRC, which is literally Her Majesty's Royal Coven, which is a real tax company in the UK. But in this world, it's kind of reimagined of like, oh, the mundane people who don't have magic powers think it's a tax department, but actually it's a coven. That's the kind of ruling party, the parliament, the government, whatever you want to call it, for the magical people in the UK, specifically for women. Because in this world, women have specifically more powerful magic than men do. And so this book follows 4 girls who kind of grew, well, not girls, they're now women, but they grew up together, they learned magic together, and now they've grown up and gone their separate ways. And there's this kid at the center that some people think is actually going to be like the bringer of evil, and some people are like, actually, no, this kid's kind of awesome. And it really tackles the subject of trans rights. What I found fascinating about this book is I didn't really know that was going to be a topic. I mean, I think I had an idea going in because I did know that this author was trans, so I had a feeling that that was going to be incorporated in some way, but I wasn't sure what that was going to be. And it is like the main focus of this book is we're watching a kid kind of figure out who they are and then where they fit in the society. And so there's just a lot of conversations that surround that, and I found it fascinating. I loved these conversations. What I loved about this book is that, yes, the trans rights issue is at the forefront of the story. The plot does not suffer because of that. It goes hand in hand with the story of like all these deeper conversations are important for the plot to move forward, and the plot needs to move forward to have these deep conversations. So it's kind of like they pair really well together to move the story along, and you can see the author's trying to make some points, and you can very clearly see these are the points she's trying to make, but it's heavy-handed, but it's not too heavy-handed where you're just like, okay, you're on a soapbox, I need you to come down. It's more like, oh, I see what you're saying, but this has a point for future. And I just really liked the meshing of that, because it's really easy where you could have an important message get lost in the plot, or you can have the plot get completely taken away because you're so focused on a message. And that's not what happened here. It really did just kind of mesh together really well. And I can't wait to see what else is in this series because it ended on a cliffhanger and I have many questions. So I just really loved it. It was not at all what I expected, and I loved it for that. Coming in at number 7 is Stars of Fortune by Nora Roberts. This is the first book in a trilogy, and it is called the Guardians Trilogy, and it basically follows these 6 strangers who are searching for these fallen stars. And each of these people have a very specific reason why they're searching for the star, and they all have secrets that they keep very close to their chest. And each book in the trilogy follows a couple within this group as they search for one star. So this one I think is the Star of Fire. And then we have Star of Ice and Star of Water. So the next 2 books in the series will follow a different couple than they did in this book, and we'll focus on finding that star. But all 6 people in this group are really important. I'm still not sure how to explain to you why this one was my favorite and why it worked so well for me, because there are so many things against this book. It is a very detached writing style. It's a little reminiscent of like J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings series, which I am not the biggest fan of the books for. It has, because of that detached writing style, you kind of see like, oh, the action's over there. And that's a little bit what this felt like, just a little bit, but it still worked. The romance in here was fantastic. I loved the plot. I fell in love with every single one of the characters in here. I wanted the best for them. This is not a big book, but it's still a good 300 pages, which should take me a few days, and I think I finished this in 1 because I was just so invested in what was going on. So I'm not sure if there's anything specific about this, or I just had no expectations and thought I was going to not really like it when I went in, so that when I went in and did actually enjoy it, it was so surprising. So I'm not doing a very good job of explaining why I liked this one, but this is one of the ones on this list that I feel like is a little, it stumps me why I liked it, but it was just the whole plot, characters. I loved the story that was being told. I loved the unexpectedness of all these people and why they're looking for the star, because each one has, like I said, a secret. And when you find out the secret, you're like, oh, that's a new layer on top of this. And so it does get a little complex, but in a fun way. So I don't know, it's just, I expected a fluffy romance and it became this fantastical story, and I just loved it. The next one is purely for entertainment value, and that is Choosing Theo. I always forget this author's name. It's Victoria something. I'm so sorry, but she's right here. This is the first in a series, and this is an alien romance that I really thought I was going to like going in, but I had never heard anything about it. One of my friends has read it, and she swears by it. And so I was like, well, if she likes it, there's a very good chance I will. But she's literally the only person I've ever heard talk about it. So I loved it. Do not let the fact that it is an alien romance steer you off of it if you are slightly interested in it, because it doesn't have the vibe of an alien romance, except for that it is taking place on another planet, and the social customs are a little bit different than they are in like our society. But as far as like physicality of the people, all humanoid, pretty normal like that. Follow our main 2 characters, and our main female lead basically gets taken from Earth and taken to this planet, and we're not sure why. And so she gets basically discovered by one of the governments, or someone in the government, and they figure out that like, oh, she's taken, we're trying to figure out why, but you can live here, but in order to do so, we need you to basically get married. And marriages in this world are a little bit different. They only last for 3 months unless you want to extend them. And mate is a thing, but they haven't heard of it in many years. And the population is, I wouldn't say going extinct, but is scary because there's not very many females in the society. So the idea of having marriages last so short is so that if you feel like you found your person, then feel free to stay, but if not, then move on, because we need you to populate with more females, and it's more likely that they will give birth to a son than a daughter, and so like it's just kind of like their way of trying to repopulate the globe or their society. So our main female lead is put in this situation, and so she picks one of the guys who no one thinks is attractive because he has all of these black markings, as you can see from the cover here, all over his skin. They look like tattoos to you and me as well as her, and in this world it's not their burns, and they just happen to have these markings on their body anyway, but they're not black. They're like silvery, kind of luminescent a little bit, but he had an accident when he was younger, and that's why they have turned black. And she sees no problem with it. She's like, I find that attractive, great. And it's their romance. So it does have, I'm sure there's a lot of critical stuff that like you could dive deep into the society of this and why it doesn't really work and, you know, whatever. But I honestly, pure enjoyment. I loved this book. It was so much fun. I loved her writing. I loved the characters. It did have a lot of the like smutty romance scenes that you would expect from a book like this, but there was still so much plot, there's still so much character development, there was so much world building that I was surprised by. This world is fascinating to me, and seeing her discover it and seeing her own prejudices against it, because she comes from a different world and she's confused why they do certain things and then is hurt when they are confused by her, and so she's kind of getting over that as well. And it's just fascinating. It was so interesting, and I loved these characters, and it was fun, and I read it in like a day, and I want to reread it. Like, I've definitely gone back and reread like sections of it because I just really enjoyed my time. So yeah, it was great. I loved it. All right, coming in at number 5. We're halfway there, guys. It is A Daughter of the Trolls by Mackenzie Catron. This is a YA fantasy book that is a little bit based on mythology. We follow our main character, Sparrow, who lives in a wheelchair because of a heart condition that she has been born with, which makes her really, really weak, and therefore she can't move around very easily, so she lives in a wheelchair. And she lives in this place called the Glade with her mom, and it's basically this place, it's just a collection of magical creatures. You've got elves, gnomes, there's so many different people, trolls, imps, stuff like that. And this big, bad, evil person ends up coming in and destroying things, and her mom ends up goes missing. And so she ends up having to go on this adventure with her friend Rush, and it's her traveling through the woods in a wheelchair. And it's that kind of conversation of disability and living in a world that's not accessible to you and stuff like that. And then seeing her conversations with Rush, who, you know, is saying the wrong thing or trying to be helpful and not, and, you know, those kinds of conversations. And what I loved about this book was, first off, the world is fantastic. The world that this author has created is beautiful and like so vibrant, and the magic system is amazing. And I find like sometimes you can find a loophole. I have like zero faults with this magic system. I think it's fascinating. Everything makes sense. I loved the world. I loved the story. I loved our characters. I loved the conversations that were had surrounding disability. Obviously, I can't speak on representation and how well that works. I will mention that the author herself lives in a wheelchair for a very, very similar reason to Sparrow. I follow her online. That's why I know. So I would assume that the representation is relatively accurate to her life, but again, don't quote me on that. Just want to put that out there because it seems like it comes from a relatively real place. So the conversations were really fascinating to see happen, and just it's very similar to the HMRC in the sense of like you have these conversations and these not political, but social conversations that the author is trying to have, but it pairs really well with the world. It doesn't take away from the world. It just kind of adds to the plot. And it's not used as a plot device. It's just something that's there. And so I really liked the meshing of those two things. Again, my review is probably pretty similar to the HMRC in that respect. But I physically read this book, which I take forever to physically read. Like, if I'm able to physically read one book a month, I'm living life, you know? And I was able to do this in less than a week, which it's not very long, but the ability that I was able to make time for this because I fell in love with it so much. And I just flew through the writing. Like, it's so accessible and I loved it. So yeah, I highly recommend this book, and I can't wait to see what other stuff the author comes out with in the future, because I know that there's more coming. Coming in at number 4 is From Blood and Ash, and this is by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I read this earlier this year. I think it was April sometime, and I just fell in love with these characters. I fell in love with the story. It had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. Like, from page 1, like, I don't know how she was able to hook me that quickly, but within pages I was like invested in already what was going on, and I hadn't really even met half of our characters yet. So I understand the hype that surrounds this book. I want to continue. I say that all the time, but I need to continue with this series. But this follows Poppy, and she is what's called the Maiden, which means that she is going to be given to the gods, which no one's really sure what exactly that means. But it means that she has a lot of like really strict rules in her life. She wears all white. She has her face covered. No one can see her face. She can't experience pleasure. That's the one that sticks out in my head, but there's a lot more. Like, it sounds like she's basically not allowed to have fun. She can't experience any kind of emotions, and she ends up getting a new bodyguard named Hawk, and he makes her rethink some stuff, and it's her story from there. It is a fantasy book. There are some very interesting fantastical elements to it, and the twist at the end, I guessed and didn't guess at the same time. So, like, it was so good. I remember the end of this book, like the second half of this book, I ended up listening to on audiobook in the car because I was stuck in traffic for like 3 hours one morning. It was ridiculous. It was a bad day. And I just remember the time flying because I was listening to this book and I was so invested in what was going on. And I was like verbally speaking out loud my feelings when things were happening. And the way that it was able to like pull emotions from me was incredible. It's very reminiscent in my head of how I felt when I was reading like Sarah J. Maas books, because she was able to have me feel all of the emotions, and that's kind of what happened with this one as well. So I adored it. I talk about it a lot, but seriously, so good. I definitely understand the hype when it comes to at least the first one, because that's what I read. Coming in at number 3 is Heidi's Guide to 4-Letter Words by Tara Civic and Andy Arnst. This I read in February, I want to say. This one was for that video I did for my friend Taylor. I read books that she had talked about, and I was interested because of her. This is amazing. Okay, let's just start there. Clearly, it's in my top 3. This book follows Heidi, and Heidi's a teacher, and there had to be some budget cuts, so her position got cut, unfortunately, and so she's looking around for a new job and ends up taking a like secretarial kind of front desk position at a audio company. Fun fact, this audio company specifically, they do a lot, but they narrate erotic romances, and she is very much like, basically she's never read an erotic romance really ever. She does read romances, but she specifically talks about like pilgrim romances, which is not very physical on the page. And so she ends up becoming friends with one of the authors there and her husband, who ends up doing the narration for her books. And this author kind of helps her kind of break out of her comfort zone. She's a really big crush on her neighbor, and the author's trying to like encourage her to go after it. While at the same time, Heidi ends up getting some leftover audio equipment and starts a podcast of her own where she starts reading these passages from stories to get herself comfortable with them and kind of come out of her shell a little bit. So it's really Heidi figuring out what she wants a little bit. I would say like maybe close to a quarter life crisis, if you will. It's not really a crisis, but you know, like that quarter life figuring out, okay, well, your plan didn't work. What now? And really kind of coming into her own, making some really good friends, maybe not starting a relationship. It has everything in this book. I laughed out loud. I cried. I awed. It does have a couple of smuttier scenes if you're into that. It also has a very, very cute scenes between her and this guy and her friendships. And like, seriously, I'm obsessed with this book, and I just love reading it over and over. The chapters switch back and forth between like regular novel narration to being transcripts of her podcasts. So you do get both of that. It is an audiobook original, or an audible original. So if you do want to get the audiobook, I highly recommend that. The narrator there is fantastic. And I really love this book. It's surprising. It's kind of comes out of nowhere. But it's so cute. It's so fun. I clearly went out and immediately bought a copy because I loved it so much. I tabbed the crap out of it. Like, it's not a long book, and I've tabbed a lot. And I don't know, I very thoroughly enjoyed my time reading it. All right, coming in at number 2. I feel like these next two, like the last two, should not be a surprise to anyone. Maybe the order they're in, but like, I talk about these two so much. So coming in at number 2 was Hitched to a Gunslinger by Michelle McLean. This one I have not shut up talking about since I read it. I believe it was in July, August, somewhere in there. I can't exactly remember when I read it, but I Loved it. I loved this book. It is a Western book, which I always say doesn't work for me. I'm not a huge Western fan, but for some reason it worked here, and I'm still not 100% sure why it did, but this author is magical. So we follow our main two characters, Gray Quickshot Wilson, who's a gunslinger, and then our female lead, who is named Mercy. And Gray has basically, like, he's done with the gunslinger game. He's good. He doesn't really want to do it anymore. He wants to retire. He wants to go find a place where he can hide out and nap all day. Like, that's what he wants from life now. And he finds this town called Desolation, which is a town of people who are hiding from things. So they don't really tell their secrets as to why they're hiding, but they're all hiding from very specific things. And so he stumbles into this town and immediately stumbles upon Mercy. So Mercy is struggling because her father recently passed away, and she is now the sole charge of this land. There's a bunch of apple orchards on it. It's her income, that kind of stuff. And there's a guy in town who's got some land nearby that really, really wants her land and has done everything in his power to get it. He has tried to buy it from her. He's tried to, propose to her so that, like, he would get it through marriage. He's basically done everything except for straight up kill her to get it. And she keeps saying no. She doesn't want to give it away. She's happy to have the land. She doesn't want him to have it. And so Gray stumbles into this scene of them arguing, and she tells this guy that, oh no, this is Gray Quickshot. You know Quickshot, he's my fiance. And they strike up a fake engagement so that she can have a little bit of protection until this guy goes away. And it's their romance, and it's so cute. It's so bantery. They are literally perfect. I really felt for these characters. I really felt them melt towards one another. And again, the banter, the conversations between the two of them are so funny. I laughed out loud so many times and awed so many times because their romance is so cute. And also, I fell in love with every single person in this town. Like, you really get to meet the town as well. And all of them are so sweet and adorable, and I want to protect them. Like, they're amazing. And the way that she's able to make me feel for the side characters in this story. Obviously, I have, like, strong feelings for our main couple, but the fact that I'm able to have as strong a feeling for all of the people in this town, that's impressive. So I just loved it, okay? I just loved it. And coming in at number 1, my favorite book of, I'm being really dramatic, of 2022 is The No-Show by Beth O'Leary. I adore this book. I have not shut up about it. Anyone who will listen, I will tell them to read this because I think everyone will enjoy this for one reason or another. It's seriously so, so good. It's my first Beth O'Leary book. I've now invested in way more because of this one. And it has a way of meshing the really important topics with a very fun, fluffy romance. So the plot of this book, basically it's from 3 different perspectives. We follow 3 women, and they all get stood up by the same guy on Valentine's Day. Now, they don't know about each other, so you keep seeing their romance with this guy, and he's trying to make up for missing Valentine's Day, and it's, that kind of thing of you're watching the story unfold, and you know that the guy is in the wrong here, but you love every single one of the relationships. You feel for these women. You think that all of them are so, like, you just kind of love every single one of these women, and so it kind of hurts you a little bit. But there is a relatively large, just a couple of pretty large plot twists near the end of this book, and it really had me rethinking everything. Like, you come to love all 3 of these women and the guy as well, and then there's these plot twists that make you so surprised. And again, the fact that each of these women are going through some stuff that, like, are pretty deeper conversations and are all connected, like, it's all connected somehow through this really, twisty thread of fate. And I just think it's so fascinating. I think it's beautiful how it was written and the stories, and I still, like, I can remember every single thing that happens in this book with, like, grave detail, and I have one of the worst memories out there, I swear. So, like, the fact that I can remember this book, I think is fantastic. Like, that's a very big testament in my mind of how good this book is. So, yeah, I don't know how else to to explain how amazing this book is, but I've not shut up about it since I read it in, I think, July or August. So yeah, here's your sign. If you haven't read it already, you should, because it's really, really good. And that's it. Those are my top reads of 2022. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you were right. Were you kind of guessing along, if you've been here for a while, what some of my favorites were? Were you correct? Were you surprised? Let me know. And let me know what your favorite, if you can narrow it down. I mean, that's a hard question. But what were, I guess, your favorite or some of your favorites from this year? But if you enjoyed this video, and I really, really hope you did, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you'd like to be part of this awesome growing family. I've also got all my social media down there, as well as other fun bookish links. So don't forget to check all that out, and I'll see you guys next year. We'll never stop making that joke. Bye!